Hi friends, this episode does contain graphic descriptions of hangings. Please, take care. Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of the Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario, and online experiences to anyone in this mortal realm. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and we thank you for joining us for this episode. Rain clouds added to the gloom of the infant morn as Hangman Ellis set forth upon his tragic mission. He reached the jail at daybreak. There was a nervous and intensely solemn-looking knot of officials and jurymen gathered in the corridors. There was a clicking of pocket watches as officials compared timepieces. "Well, boys, let's get at it," said Hangman Ellis, undoing his black bag. The cell door was opened. Guards followed by the hangman entered. There was a hurried handshake all round. Wilson's hands were tied behind him, and the procession started. Wilson took one brief look at the outside world he was leaving. It was his last. As they went, the prison chaplain chanted the Lord's Prayer. 13 steps from the cell door, and Wilson was on top of the last inch of ground he walked alive. The hangman's rope was dangling over his head, and as he quietly stood, Hangman Ellis tied his feet with straps. The rope was adjusted, and in a flash, Wilson was launched into eternity. This harrowing account of a man's last moments was captured forever in the pages of the Star Phoenix in April 1920. The story behind the execution of John Wilson in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan is unique, like all of the condemned. But somehow, it is also the same as countless others. Almost like a movie script we've seen a million times, we can imagine that readers in 1920 would likely have been curious, reading the dramatic words with interest, while feeling a mix of emotions: horror, vindication, sadness, and even pride in a justice system that held the guilty accountable. When they finished reading about Wilson, 2 columns over was a different story about another condemned man, John Watkins. His sentence had just been commuted to life in prison for killing 2 men during an argument. A soldier recently returned from the war who was in the wrong place at the wrong time, it seemed, received sympathy from the general public. His life would be spared. It wasn't uncommon for Canadians in the early 20th century to open their newspapers and read about the latest capital punishment case. They weren't everyday occurrences, but they were common enough and almost seemed routine for those reading the daily papers. John Wilson's execution, carried out on that spring day in 1920, likely faded into memory and was ultimately unremarkable for most Canadians. It was part of what made hangings palatable to the general population for so long. They were routine, carried out with professionalism and precision, reported on as if they were ordinary moments in the life cycle of society. There was always outcry and calls to abolish the death penalty, but the regularity of hangings and how they were carried out allowed them to fade into the background. One of the reasons executions were carried out with such professionalism was because of a main character in our story, Hangman Ellis. He was not an employee of the prison at Prince Albert, nor was he a judge, prison guard, former convict, or policeman. Hangman Ellis was a professional hangman, employed by the Canadian state to carry out hangings whenever and wherever required. His job took him from coast to coast for decades, carrying out hundreds of hangings. Most of them very ordinary, like John Wilson in Prince Albert. However, one day, Ellis's hangings caught the attention of the general public, and suddenly, it wasn't ordinary anymore. In this episode, we will delve into the careers of Canada's official hangmen, John Radclive and Arthur English, better known by his pseudonym, Arthur Ellis. But before we get to that, do you love ghost stories? Are you intrigued by dark history? Join us on a haunted walk, the ultimate spooky adventure in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario. Our expert storytellers will take you on a journey through the city's most haunted locations, sharing chilling tales of ghostly encounters and unexplainable happenings. From haunted jails to forgotten graveyards, the Haunted Walk will transport you to another time and place. Join us on a spine-tingling paranormal adventure. Book your tickets now at hauntedwalk.com. On our website, you can also find information about our online experiences, which can be enjoyed from anywhere in the world. Spend an eerie night in with our Haunting at Home online paranormal adventure, or grab a spot around our virtual haunted campfires and hear some of the best storytellers in the world share their favorite creepy stories. Information on our Haunting at Home, virtual haunted campfires, and our in-person ghost tours can be found on our website, hauntedwalk.com. My birthday is coming up very soon, and my special wish is that you follow, rate, and review the show wherever you listen. Whether you're a new listener or an old friend, we want to hear from you. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, all at Haunted Walk, for the latest updates, new episodes, blog posts, and some finely curated spooky memes. To begin, let's talk a bit about conducting a hanging and the role of the executioner. Since Canadian Confederation in 1867, Canada has only had one form of lawful execution. Taking cues from Great Britain, the Canadian state hanged the condemned, with a total of 710 executions from 1867 until 1962. Even before Canada adopted hangings as its official form of execution, they were fraught with spectacle and drama. British hangings were known for drawing crowds of people and even instigating riots when the public was unconvinced the condemned were guilty. Countless others died at executions, crushed by crowds or beaten back by justice officials. The role of the executioner was deeply unpopular. You may have an image in your mind of what an executioner looks like, fueled by fairy tale and Hollywood. A large and stoic man with a black hood concealing his identity. Some of that image is true. Executioners frequently wore hoods or masks so crowds wouldn't recognize them. The stereotype may have come about because many executioners, before the 19th century, were actually condemned prisoners themselves. Some were offered deals to become an official executioner in exchange for a pardon or reprieve. In other cases, judges or lawyers would be responsible for arranging and sometimes even carrying out the hangings. More often, it was the guards, jail officials, policemen, and sheriffs. This piecemeal system of choosing the executioner meant many botched hangings occurred, committed by people who had no idea what they were doing. By the mid-19th century, the calls to end state executions were growing. An expanding and educated middle class were concerned with the morality of society, and the inhumaneness of executions received plenty of attention. In response, throughout the British Empire, there was a concerted attempt to professionalize executions and end the spectacle that so often accompanied them. One of the first tactics was banning large public gatherings. While there were some public hangings early in Canada's history, including Patrick James Whalen at the old Ottawa jail, they were mainly closed-off affairs with small groups of witnesses, family members, clergy, lawyers, and doctors. The second major move was to hire an official hangman, someone who would be responsible for carrying out the final act with unemotional precision. Over time, a repeated ritual began to unfold, and hangings eventually became a rather ordinary and unremarkable occurrence in the everyday justice system of Canada. Into our story walks John Radclive, Canada's first and arguably only official hangman, and the predecessor of Arthur Ellis. John Radclive was hired by the Dominion government in 1892, 2 decades after the British government had adopted the practice of putting executioners on the payroll. John Radcliffe's early life is shrouded in some mystery, but according to his own account, he became interested in hangings during his time in the Royal Navy, where he observed the botched execution of pirates. He was troubled by their suffering and worked to develop a method that resulted in a quicker death. He claimed he was motivated solely by compassion, not a morbid interest in mortality. It is unknown how much he was trained by William Marwood, the famous British executioner, but he was certainly inspired by him and the new science around hangings. Marwood developed the technique known as the long drop, where the precise length of rope used in a hanging was calculated using a table of weights and measures. This scientific method ensured the condemned person's neck would break rather than a long, drawn-out strangulation or a gruesome decapitation. The table of weights and measures was slightly refined over time, but it was so successful that botched hangings became increasingly rare. John Radclive is credited as the first professional hangman in Canada to use the long drop method and ensure hangings were relatively seamless. His reasoning always stayed the same from the first days of his career to the last. As their sentences were carried out, the condemned didn't deserve to suffer. For this, he was regarded as a very compassionate man who was rather soft-spoken and unremarkable. His contemporaries found it difficult to believe that such a man could carry out executions for a living. But many simply didn't know, as the post was largely anonymous. Before becoming Canada's official executioner, he was reported to be everything from a whaler to a cook to a grocer, a fairly ordinary life. After his death, his neighbors spoke lovingly about this man who liked children and was always willing to lend a hand. Numerous accounts of his hangings are filled with statements about his compassion for the prisoners, particularly as they fearfully stepped onto the scaffold. Not surprisingly, there is some evidence that Radclive was morally troubled by his work. He stopped conducting hangings about 2 years before his death at the age of 55 and began to give more accounts of his grisly work. He likely died from complications due to alcoholism. He was known to drink heavily following every execution and lived a reclusive life during his final months. Radclive even reversed his stance on the death penalty. While he previously believed he was simply carrying out the will of the justice system, he became convinced that executions were immoral and people would be judged for enabling them. Radclive officially committed 69 executions for the Canadian state, but his obituary claims the total number during the course of his life to be over 150. It seems that, in the end, Radclive was bothered by each and every one of them, and died a very troubled man in 1911. Before his retirement, John Radclive had trained an apprentice, the man who would become known as Arthur Ellis. Like Radclive, not a lot is known about Ellis's early life. His obituary notes he was the son of a British soldier, and he had served in India during the colonial period. Similar to Radclive, he became interested in hangings after watching many failed executions while serving overseas. He later claimed he was trained under Britain's official hangman, although it's unclear which one. His training and inspiration from Britain explains why the man named Arthur English officially adopted the pseudonym Arthur Ellis. John Ellis was the pseudonym used for London's official executioner at the time. Arthur Ellis came to Canada primarily in search of an executioner's job and started training under Radclive. He was listed as the assistant to Canada's official hangman and learned the many techniques that Radclive had developed over the years. Ellis also used the long drop technique, taking immense pride in calculating the exact lengths to ensure a smooth and efficient hanging. It also seemed that Ellis had adopted many of the same morals as Radclive, understanding the purpose of his job as a compassionate executioner. However, while Radclive was noted for outwardly showing sympathy to the condemned and even being gentle with the prisoners as he led them to their deaths, Ellis adopted a more matter-of-fact and stoic approach. It was clear to many that he didn't delight in executing people, but he did take pride in his role administering justice and preventing suffering. Perhaps it was this stoic attitude that allowed him to conduct so many more hangings than his predecessor. Ellis had a slightly different role than Radclive. For one, it's unclear if he was ever officially an employee for the Dominion of Canada. In 1922, the Justice Department clearly affirmed that despite committing many hangings across the country, Ellis was not the official hangman of Canada, and executioners were a provincial matter, not a federal one. Ellis was listed as an executioner of Quebec, however. This law was further clarified in the 1930s, when sheriffs were to complete executions, but were permitted and even encouraged to hire experienced hangmen to do the work. Following Ellis's death, hangmen were enlisted across the country, so the onus was no longer on a single man in one jurisdiction. Ellis did petition to become an official hangman for the Dominion, but was denied the position, as the Department of Justice was trying to distance itself from the gruesome job title. Despite some ambiguity in his actual job title, Ellis was the de facto official hangman, conducting more hangings across the country than anyone before or after him. The number in Canada is confirmed over 200, but he reportedly performed over 500 throughout his career around the world. He was hired for $150 to $200 per hanging, plus travel expenses, a very handsome sum at the time compared to what his British and American counterparts would be paid. The preferred hangman wasn't always available, and sometimes jail officials had to improvise. After Radclive's retirement, there was an ongoing question of who should be hired when an execution was scheduled. As this question was pondered, executions continued, and Canadian jails were left without someone to call upon. The situation prompted a Gas Bay jail to post an advertisement in the newspaper to come to the jail and apply. It's difficult to imagine a hiring fair for hangmen, but officials didn't have much choice. In the end, they didn't hire a temporary executioner, as the condemned was granted mercy. This was probably for the best, as all candidates were deemed unsuitable for the position. In another case, in Alberta, the preferred hangman, Ellis, was unavailable due to a scheduling conflict. So a man wearing a mask and a fake mustache stepped in. Some commented that he closely resembled a guard at the jail, but no one could be certain. Thankfully, even with his lack of training, that hanging had no complications. If you're interested in hearing that full story, check out episode 59, The Unknown Hangman. Like Radclive, many of his contemporaries were surprised that Ellis performed the duties of an executioner as a part-time job. The position was still largely secretive, and most of his friends and associates had no idea what he did in his spare time. He was an animated public speaker and an effective electoral campaign manager for Sir Lomer Gouin, a premier of Quebec and cabinet minister, who had no clue his colleague was a hangman. Most of us could forgive Gouin for not realizing it. Described as unassuming at 5'3" with thick, black-rimmed glasses, Arthur Ellis was not the stereotypical image of a hangman that most of us have in our minds. Even when he donned the official robes and tall black hat of the executioner, standing at the edge of the gallows, he managed to look ordinary. He was personable and friendly, not menacing or morbid. When he traveled across Canada doing his work, he made plenty of friends on the train, until he revealed his true profession, and suddenly passengers distanced themselves and he was left alone. It is clear from newspaper reports that Ellis took his job very seriously and committed his duties with professionalism. Like Radclive, he believed the hangman is simply carrying out the will of the justice system, and he was not the one doing the killing. Despite all its seriousness, Ellis developed a bit of a ritual that seemed a bit quirky. He always wore a white carnation on his lapel. Paired with his executioner's robe and tall black hat, he would have been quite distinctive. According to a few newspaper reports, he also had the habit of clicking his heels of his black patent leather shoes right before sending the criminal on their way. His communication to the condemned was professional, but he wasn't as sympathetic as his predecessor. Although he had a decent reputation, Ellis put himself into a compromising position early in his career. A few nights before a hanging was scheduled to take place, Ellis was reportedly drinking heavily in a local establishment. After arriving at a theater intoxicated, he began wielding a pistol that he kept for protection. The job of executioner was an unpopular one, after all. Ellis couldn't be put in jail or formally charged. It would be an embarrassment to everyone involved. So he was fined and housed in the prison until the hanging was to take place. Later, he denied the entire affair and claimed it was falsely reported by the press. Wherever the truth lies with that incident, Ellis wasn't free from controversy, particularly as he hit the twilight of his career. Ellis was in his 70s when he was called out to conduct the hanging of Thomasina Sarau in Montreal. Little did Ellis know that this would be his most infamous. Thomasina Sarau and 2 accomplices were convicted of murdering the woman's husband for insurance money. Executing women was already unpopular and uncommon, so the spotlight was on the accused as she was led by Ellis to the gallows on March 25, 1935. He had prepared the rope ahead of time, referring to his trusted weights and measures with a report of Mrs. Sarau's weight when she was incarcerated over a year before. Everything was set in place. Ellis likely performed his little ritual before pulling the lever of the gallows. Sarau dropped through the trapdoor, but to everyone's horror, she was decapitated. According to Ellis, he received an incorrect weight for Sarau and thus miscalculated the length of rope required for the hanging. She apparently had gained considerable weight while in jail, and the longer rope, paired with the heavier body, had resulted in the decapitation. The sight must have been gruesome to witness, and the entire incident greatly shifted public opinion for years to come. After Sarau's execution, witnesses were no longer permitted to view hangings. They would only be overseen by a tiny group of officials. It wasn't the first time that Ellis had inadvertently taken someone's head off. Over a decade earlier, a miscalculation had botched the hanging of a heavier man. But Thomasina Sarau was a woman, and executing women was already a questionable practice at the time. Ellis was caught up in a public firestorm, but he defended his practice and pointed to his rather clean record as an executioner. Contrary to many reports, Ellis didn't immediately retire. He continued with hangings despite his bruised reputation. In fact, over a year later, he was called upon to simultaneously perform 6 hangings in British Columbia, even though only 3 went ahead as scheduled. Nonetheless, the botched hanging of Thomasina Sarau affected Ellis. It's true that he carried out fewer hangings afterward and mostly retired from the public spotlight. His identity was no longer a secret, and he couldn't take on an ordinary job after serving as an executioner. He died in Montreal after a brief illness only a few years past that infamous day. It is also reported that he died due to starvation. The exact cause and situation of his death is murky, but it's clear he was broken and impoverished. Like Radclive, Ellis was known as a heavy drinker throughout his career, a situation that accelerated after his identity was revealed and he could no longer conceal his gruesome work. However, unlike Radclive, Ellis never publicly spoke out against the death penalty or penned any troubled accounts before he died. The heavy weight on his moral conscience is only speculation. Despite his silence on the issue, Arthur Ellis can still be credited as a key reason for the abolition of the death penalty in Canada. His botched hanging of Thomasina Sarau inspired reformers in the mid-20th century. It took 2 decades, partially delayed by the outbreak of the Second World War, but a parliamentary committee was set up to examine the death penalty in 1954. Members of the committee were urged to call upon Canada's hangmen to provide testimony. After Ellis died, the identity of these figures were kept strictly secret. The committee initially declined, saying it would be too gruesome to hear about decapitations. Eventually, they called on Quebec's hangman at the time, and perhaps his accounts influenced their report. The committee's findings didn't immediately spell the end of the death penalty, but rather another botched hanging in 1962 at Toronto's Don Jail did, when Arthur Lucas's head was torn off. A Salvation Army chaplain who was there reported in grisly detail that his head was hanging just by the sinews of the neck, and there was blood all over the floor. Making that situation even more tragic was that 2 executions were scheduled for that evening, just minutes apart, with Lucas going first. There was not enough time between to clean the room, which makes the hanging of Ronald Turpin the last in Canada, which took place moments later, even more disturbing. When Parliament finally voted in 1976 to end the practice, Thomasina Sarau's beheading was once again raised as an important reason for eliminating the gruesome practice. While Ellis wasn't directly responsible for ending executions, his actions were cited again and again as a cause for its elimination. Arthur Ellis continues to live on, even after his death and the end of the death penalty. The Arthur Ellis Award was a prize given by the Crime Writers of Canada to the country's top fiction and non-fiction crime writers for decades. The name of the award was recently changed, and Arthur Ellis was officially retired. Fans of the new crime series, 3 Pines, may have caught the reference to Ellis in a 2022 episode. Based on Louise Penny's novella of the same name, it tells the fictional story of a man using the pseudonym Arthur Ellis found hanging in the forest. No further spoilers if you haven't seen or read it. If you ask Canadian criminal history buffs who Canada's official executioner was, they'll probably say Arthur Ellis, despite him not holding the title like his predecessor. The historical memory of Ellis has probably lived on because of the morbid fascination our society has with the job, trying to imagine ourselves in that line of work. Let's consider it: an anonymous man who otherwise lives a very normal life, being paid to travel across the country to commit executions in a ritualized yet professional way. We have every reason to be fascinated. Both John Radclive and Arthur Ellis were very ordinary people who were called upon to commit rather gruesome acts for the benefit of society. While they attempted to distance themselves from the work, they were responsible for killing people at the direction of the state. It was their hand, in the end, that committed the final act. These troubling images reportedly haunted Radclive and were very likely the end of Ellis's tormented career as well. By way of an epilogue, it amazes me that often when we're working on these episodes, major news related to the topic will often break. And that was the case last week when a new survey found support for the death penalty has risen over the past year. Reading here from an article in the Toronto Star, a majority of Canadians support bringing back the death penalty, and a slight increase from the same time last year, according to a new poll. Survey results, released Friday from opinion research firm ResearchCo, found 54% of Canadian respondents favored reinstating capital punishment for murder convictions, with more than 70% of conservative voters being in favor. According to Mario Canseco, president of ResearchCo, support for capital punishment rose 3% from last year, after 3 years of remaining stagnant. Canseco told The Star, "What is interesting to me is that we have these numbers in a time when nobody's talking about the death penalty. Change usually happens on questions like this when a political party starts talking about things more openly. In 2022, 51% of Canadians supported the death penalty. The figure had remained relatively unchanged from 50% in 2021 and 51% in 2020. Although most Canadians support the idea of capital punishment, they're less eager when it comes to specific cases," Canseco said. For example, when given the option between sentencing a hypothetical murder convict to life imprisonment or execution, the majority of respondents chose life in prison. Canseco said, "Canadians are flirting with the notion of the death penalty, but once we get down to judiciary issues, they're not as convinced that it's the right course of action." According to the survey, 25% of respondents believe capital punishment is never appropriate, while 9% said it's always appropriate, and 58% think the death penalty is sometimes okay. I have to wonder what John Radclive and Arthur Ellis would think of this news. Thank you so much for joining us. If you're interested in exploring the topic of the history of capital punishment in Canada a little more, I would strongly suggest you listen to our episode 129, entitled Canadian Women and Capital Punishment, which takes a close look at a number of cases where women were ultimately given the death penalty. For information about our in-person ghost tours in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, as well as our online experiences, including the Haunting at Home and our virtual haunted campfires, please visit our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. And be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, all at Haunted Walk. Be sure to follow the show wherever you listen so you know when the new episodes come out. And if you have a moment, if you could leave a 5-star rating and review wherever you listen. As always, a big thank you to our Haunted Talks team, including Brittany Buss, who researched and wrote this episode, and Michelle Dennis, our outstanding audio editor. Until we meet again, sweet dreams.